My family and I are hikers. Now, as often as we can, we try to take to the trails and enjoy nature in all of its peace and its solitude. Recently, we went on a little short 2-mile trek, mostly just to get out of the house and enjoy a warm, sunny day here in November. As we hiked, the mental noise and clutter of the things that have been going on in my life kind of began to intrude and began to rob me of this relaxed mood that we were enjoying. And I didn't realize just how much it was robbing me of it until I yelled at Donovan for falling down. Now, he's 8. He's a little wobbly on his feet. But like most 8-year-olds, he's full of energy. And at that moment, he needed to expend some of that. So he took off running down the trail. He was running full tilt and he stumbled over some rocks. And as he hit the ground, I yelled something at him about getting up or something, I don't know. But it was a response born not out of the situation itself, but honestly, more from the anxiety that came from the clutter that I was dealing with in my head. And Heather turned around and she looked at me and she offered a few less than gracious things about me yelling at him. And then she added something. He has to learn to fall. He has to know how to hit the ground and pick himself up. These words, he has to learn to fall. He has to know how to hit the ground and pick himself up, are, I think, apropos for the situation that our Greater United Methodist Church finds itself in. Now, I normally don't talk much about this, but I think this is worth maybe a word or two at the beginning of the sermon. Historically, it seems to me like every generation of every denomination has needed to fall and pick itself up again. In this case, the Methodists have been falling for years. Since 1840 and the schism between the Methodist Episcopal Church and Methodist Episcopal Church South. Since the end of the classes and bands in the late 19th century. Since the 1920s and the rise of liberal or Boston theology in our seminaries. Since 1972, when the General Conference instituted wording on homosexual ministers and homosexual marriage. Depending on your context, any or all of these things can be positive or negative, and yet each of them marks a point in which disagreement arose and was never really settled. In each of these cases, we as Methodists decided either to leave each to his own, or we simply ignored the existence of these things happening by hiding in our local context and in our local churches. What's happening right now with the Commission on the Way Forward and the 2019 General Conference is the UMC having to figure out how to get back up. We've been falling and now we've hit the ground. The question is, how are we going to get up? Now, options exist from the extremes and the middle with a great deal of commentary from all sides. At times it's polite and in the name of good discourse, and at other times it's been hostile with ill intent. It's been more to the ill intent to the point that this past week, or within the last week or so, the Council of Bishops had to issue a letter that said, in recent months we have experienced these negative behaviors escalating into more aggressive and violent expressions of hate, prejudice, and anger directed against others. We are hearing and observing angry words now escalating to actions that are resulting in fear, anxiety, loss of security, and even physical harm. These actions are repugnant to your bishops. As I watched my son lie there on the trail, every instinct demanded that I reach down and help him up. I'm his father. He's my son. This should be a no-brainer. And yet, he needed to lie there. He needed to feel the sting of those scratches and those bruises as a reminder that next time he's going to have to be more careful. In a way, I think God is allowing the United Methodist Church to hit the ground and feel the sting and the sharp pain from the wounds we've inflicted on ourselves and pick ourselves up again. Many questions abound as to how, and frankly, I have no idea what that'll look like. Who knows? But I believe that no matter what is done, we will have to correct the hostility and take more of a gracious and thankful attitude in order to hear and respond to one another. I believe our situation is reminiscent of some of the things that Paul had experienced as he writes to the Philippian church. Philippians, whether you may know or not, is a twofer, meaning that it may have been two or more letters collected over time as a single piece of correspondence, similar to 2 Corinthians. Paul wrote the letter of Philippians after a not so gracious beginning in Philippi, making the first section of this friendship letter an even more gracious response from the apostle. And as Paul wrote to them from a prison cell, I imagine he thought about this, wondered about this. As with most of Paul's letters and those of antiquity, there's a particular formula. It's got a salutation, a thanksgiving, then the body of the letter and some moral and ethical instruction, and then finally the closing. We're going to look at the Thanksgiving section this morning. And one of the things we'll notice is that within the Thanksgiving section, there are three things that he says. First off, he offers an expression of gratitude, then an expression of affection, and followed by a prayer for the church. Now he starts off by talking about how thankful he is for the Philippian congregation. Specifically, he's thankful when he prays, saying that a prayer about and for the congregation is a prayer full of joy. And the second part he talks about his affection for them, saying that he keeps the congregation in his heart. He calls them partners in grace. He even compares his feelings toward the congregation to the compassion of Jesus. He ends this section with a prayer for the Philippian congregation that they will be insightful, knowledgeable, and that knowledge would be used to make good decisions about what really matters, while being filled with the fruit of righteousness in order to give glory and praise to God. Now, what I think makes this an interesting expression of thanksgiving is when you read Acts chapter 16 and you see what Paul dealt with when he first came to Philippi. One exercise that I would encourage you to do when you're reading through the New Testament, especially when you're reading the letters of Paul, is to go back and read through the book of Acts. Because starting in chapter 9 of the book of Acts, we pick up with Paul's story. And a lot of information about the people that he will visit, that he will write letters to, is contained in the story that follows after that. If you read Acts from chapter 9 all the way to the end, you'll find quite a bit about Paul and these people that he's going to be writing to. And so, when we look at his first trip to Philippi in Acts chapter 16, we see that in verses 6 through 10 of the chapter, he has a vision. It's a vision from a man in Macedonia who pleads with him, "Come over, help us." Paul hears this and responds to this vision, bringing along with him some companions that included Timothy and Silas. And he went to Philippi. He began to minister to people. Now, normally the way that Paul did this was he would go into the synagogue, if there was one, and he would talk to whoever the Jewish leaders were that were there. Then he might talk to people in the city market. Paul was very particular about not wanting anybody to support him financially if he could help it. And so he had learned a trade of tent making. He would go into the market, maybe look for work, but he would also talk to the other people in the market, the other people in his trade. And so as they were walking around talking to these different people, they met a woman named Lydia, who was a Gentile God worshiper. And she had a particular business. She dealt with dyed purple cloth. It's a business that would have catered to the elite of the city and been relatively profitable. Lydia, at that point, becomes a follower of Jesus. She and her entire household are baptized, a practice that was pretty common in the early church. Lydia would become a prominent member and supporter of Paul's ministry in Philippi. She and others would help to continue the work after Paul left and went on to other cities. But Paul's work in Philippi was not without difficulty. As he and Silas were walking to pray one morning, a slave woman who had a spirit that enabled her to predict the future called out to them. "These people are servants of the Most High God," she said. "They are proclaiming a way of salvation to you." Now the Bible says this annoyed Paul. And when I first heard that, I thought, why would he be annoyed at that? And then I thought about it a little bit more, and I realized that it was most likely because this woman was a slave. She was being used and abused by her masters, her owners, even as she was declaring a truth. Paul drove the spirit out of the woman, leaving her owners without the means for making money off of her gift. So, as with anybody who has been wronged financially in that day and age, they decided they might get even. They went to the authorities, and they claimed that Paul and his friends were causing an uproar in the city. There were Jews who promoted customs that we Romans can't accept or practice. They're not like us. They don't do the things we do. They're anti-Roman because they're different. And also because they're taking money away from us. So the crowds around them began to join the slave owners, no doubt afraid that Paul and Silas might find ways to take away their entertainment or livelihood. And eventually the authorities had the two of them stripped, beaten, and thrown in jail. Now, you're probably familiar with the next incident. It gets preached about quite frequently. But we have the rather famous incident of the earthquake that shook the prison. You know the story. They were in there, they were praying, and they were singing, and all of a sudden the earth began to shake. The walls began to shake. The doors flew open. And yet, as the jailer came in, fearing for his own life because the prisoners surely would have escaped, he found everybody right where they were. Nobody left. They just sat there and continued on. The jailer was so impressed with this that he heard the message of Paul and Silas, and eventually he and his household became followers of Jesus. Now, Paul and Silas being beaten and thrown into prison, you might think that would leave a bad taste in their mouth regarding that city. You might even think that someone would consider never stepping foot in that city again, never contacting anyone there. It wouldn't be an unreasonable response given the suffering that Paul had experienced. And yet, when we read the first part of Philippians, we hear Paul offering these words of affirmation and encouragement to the church at Philippi. How is that? How is that you experience something horrible and yet you can still find a way to be at peace with the situation and even be grateful, thankful for people that are there? Well, Paul saw the big picture. The situation with the slave woman and the slavers had nothing to do with the church at Philippi. From everything we see in Acts 16, Paul is treated well and supported in his efforts by Lydia and the jailer and others who have come to believe in Jesus. And those are the people he writes this letter to. You'll notice that the letter does not begin with the salutation to the slavers and people of the marketplace who had us beaten and thrown into prison. No, it's addressed to those in Philippi who are God's people in Christ Jesus, along with your supervisors and servants. Paul was able to see the big picture and recognize that the people of the church at Philippi were not responsible for his suffering. and offer the church encouragement and affirmation. And when we look at life, we have a tendency to lump the good in with the bad, especially if the bad was a particularly painful thing to experience and to remember. Yet in the bad, there's quite often good. Off the top of my head, I can think of places that I would not necessarily want to serve as pastor again. The experience of those places was rather painful to me and painful to my family. And in a way, just being there would bring back all of the things and all of the difficulty that were suffered. Yet I still have many friends in those places. I have many people who supported our ministry while we were there. And they worked to continue the ministries that we started. While I would not see me as being the pastor of those places and see that as being a profitable appointment, I still see immense value in the ministries that are there. And I have great affection for those people who loved and cared for us while we served there. It reminds me of the old saying about throwing the baby out with the bathwater. You know where that comes from, right? That comes from the old medieval practice of how people took baths back then. The man of the house would take the bath first. There would be one tub of water, and so he would bathe, and then the oldest male children, and then the women, and then finally the baby would get the bath last. If you weren't careful and the baby slid up under the water, you wouldn't be able to see it for all the dirt and the gunk and everything else that was in the tub. That's why you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Stick your hand in there, make sure the baby's not in there. And that's what we need to do when it comes to our experiences. We need to be sure there isn't anything valuable in the tub before we dump it all out. And so, as we think about things that we're thankful for, this week our sermon is on giving thanks for the hard stuff. And I want you to think about it. I want you to think about what your Philippi is. Your place that you have to be thankful of in spite of the adversity that you've experienced. What is your experience of life that was horrible and traumatizing, and yet you're grateful that you went through it? Because going through it brought you closer to God. Going through it helped you to grow closer to those that you loved. Going through it helped you to grow and be more Christ-like because you learned from it and you grew from it.